We are people of the cross. The Lord submitted Himself to crucifixion willingly to save His enemies, and we are called to take up our cross and do the same. Every time we bring justice to bear on anybody, whether we're firing an employee or sitting in protest, we are taking the log out of our own eye. When you pull a log out of your eye, it hurts enough that there are tears. And the tears is what the world needs to see.
One of the hardest things about following Jesus is that we're called to love the people we most want to avoid or correct. I'm Dan Kruver. In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper explains how justice that flows from the cross looks different from what the world expects and why that matters. This message was originally delivered at The Cove in Asheville, North Carolina on July 29, 2007.
Let's go to verses 1 to 7 and conclude with this government piece. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. Democrat, Republican, they're all from God. Whoever gets elected next November a year, will be God's choice. And dictators in Cuba, North Korea, China, Vietnam, they're all by God's design. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Good grief, Paul. Wake up. Don't you want to say that? I mean, let's be respectful of the Bible, but you won't ever penetrate to the meaning of the Bible if you don't get upset by the Bible. If you don't find problems in the Bible, you won't ever grow in your understanding. I find that verse very problematical. And I'll come back and solve it for you, I hope. But good night. Rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who's in authority? Then do what is good, and you'll receive his approval. And that's absolutely absurd. Isn't it? Chapter 8. We are being killed all day long. We are counted as sheep to be slaughtered. Who's doing that? Caesar. So you got to be just nonplussed by these words. He writes like he's not alive in the real world. There's a reason for why he writes this way. Submit yourself to the Bible. There's a lot of scoffers who come to the Bible and read that and just mock. Don't treat God's Word that way. When you see something that baffles you, just realize you got something to learn. There's something to be changed in here. There's something to be figured out here. For He is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for He does not bear the sword in vain. For He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For the same reason you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Okay. Now let's think about this for a little bit. First, let's say something absolutely positive and perhaps in America too taken for granted. Namely, let's say verse 4. He is God's servant for your good. Government is a glorious blessing for our good from God. We get so sick of politics that we sometimes run a terrible risk of failing to realize what an awesome gift any government is. Now, let me illustrate what I mean. When I preached on this, it was 2005. It was June. And there was an article in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune about the city in Mexico called Nuevo Laredo, across the border of Texas. And it had collapsed into anarchy. All of the civil authorities had been overrun. I'll read you the description. Alejandro Dominguez was the only person brave enough to be police chief. Hours after he took office, assailants riddled his body with dozens of bullets in this city, racked by a turf battle between Mexico's two main drug gangs. The streets were virtually empty Thursday, a day after the killing, with only a handful of federal police armed with rifles and automatic weapons. We are defenseless, Attorney Zorino Medrano said at the City Hall. It's obvious that the criminals are better organized than the authorities. They sent the National Army and even they weren't respected. Who else can we ask for help? And I just want you to imagine your city when 911 does not answer. There are no policemen coming at your beck. There are no firemen coming at your beck. There are only mobs. And they're doing what they please with nobody to stop them. You know what would happen at that moment? You would have any dictator in a minute. Mobs are really scary. Most of you have never been near a mob. You've seen them on television. I've seen just enough violence in my neighborhood real close to know how absolutely heart-stoppingly scary violence is. Give thanks for any government at all. That we can be here. That when we drive home, we will pass people about 4 feet doing 65 miles an hour. That's a combined 130 miles an hour, which if they were to just swerve an instant before you passed, you would be cream cheese. We take obedience for granted everywhere. And this society stunningly works. Thousands of processes, thousands of procedures, thousands of ordinances and laws working. It won't work for long where a basic moral substructure isn't holding sway. There can't be enough laws to make everybody good, to make everybody keep the speed limit or keep their contracts or keep from hitting somebody over the head or keep from poisoning people. Thank you, God, for government. I think that's what Paul wants us to feel. It's a gift of God, and it was given after the fall as a dam against the river of evil in the human heart. If there were no government, there would be horrific anarchy everywhere in the world. And anarchy is worse than any government. Now, last basic issue and question. Paul, how can you speak in such absolute statements like verse 3? Rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Let's go to chapter 8. I quoted it on the fly a minute ago, but you just got to feel this. Chapter 8, verse 35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword, as it is written, for your sake we are being killed all day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. Now that's a statement of fact. Christians were killed regularly. And they were killed regularly by officials as well as mobs. And for the first 3 centuries until Constantine, to become a Christian was to risk your life officially. Not just because your relative didn't like the fact that you changed religion, but that the government said Caesar is Lord, and we say Kyrios, Christos, Christ is Lord. And that's treason. And today, in China, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and all the Muslim countries, to obey Jesus in evangelism is illegal. And will bring down the opposite of verse 3, for doing good. So Paul, please, what do you mean by talking this way? Rulers are not a terror to good conduct. They have been in many settings, but too bad, and so on. My answer to that question, and there is more than one answer, I believe, I'll just give you one suggestion, is this. I think Paul knew what he wrote in chapter 8, and he's not stupid. And when he gets to chapter 13, he knows he could write this in a very qualified way. He could write and say, Caesar's really a jerk, but submit anyway. I think Paul knows that he's writing from Corinth to Roman Christians, and he knows who's going to read this letter. Caesar's going to read this letter. The household of Caesar knows about the church. They will get this letter. It will be read by enemies, political enemies. So Paul writes, I think, in a way that communicates one thing to the church and one thing to Caesar and his household. What Caesar should read here is, you are under God. All the authorities are there by God. Do not think that you are God. The prophetic word that Caesar should pick up from this is, I'm a lackey. I'm a subordinate. I am an appointee. And secondly, he should pick up, there's a moral law I am obliged to reward. Those two messages come loud and clear to Caesar through this paragraph. The church, knowing that they've just read chapter 8 and scratching their head like I scratch mine when they read this, hears it a different way. And we talk this way. If my son sasses his mom, and I take him by the shoulders, shake him, say, you don't talk to your mother that way. He might say, I just did. I just talked to her that way. What do you mean I don't talk to her that way? I just did. I said, you need a lesson in grammar, boy. This indicative statement is an imperative. Don't we talk that way? You say to your kids, we don't do that in our family. When they just did it. We don't do that in our family. What do you mean we don't do that in our family? We mean you should not do that in our family. I think that's the way we should read this. Rulers reward the good. Well, they don't. Well, they do if they do what's right. So I think the church would hear rulers in God's universe do what they're supposed to do. Of course, if they don't, they're not obeying God, and we know they don't, but they should. I think that's what's being delivered here. Which leads me to my last question. When do you disobey them? What's the place of civil disobedience in the life of the Christian church? And I close with this. Ever? I mean, it's a pretty strong statement. Every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. Do you say, okay, never do you disobey the government? I don't think so, because there are numerous biblical instances of God-approved civil disobedience. Acts 5:27, where Peter says, you may tell us to be quiet, but we must obey God rather than man. So the officials said, don't preach this anymore. Peter goes out, starts preaching again. Daniel 6. I love this picture. Then these presidents and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the presidents in the kingdoms are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an interdict that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Therefore King Darius signed the document and the interdict. Now that is law. Nobody prays to any man or any god but me for 30 days. And then it says, and Daniel knew that the document was signed and went to his house and went up, and it had windows. And in the upper chamber, he knelt down and faced Jerusalem. Just in your face. I get in front of my window. This is not an underground church. Isn't that incredible? You tell me not to pray to my God? Where's a window? I'll die to pray to my God. The Bible has God-approved civil disobedience in it. And the question is, when? Now, here's one suggestion about when. This would be the most common suggestion. If the law of the land commands what God forbids, you don't do that commandment. Clear enough? Or if the law of the land forbids what God commands, you do it. Clear enough. I don't think that's enough. Do you? It isn't enough. It doesn't cover all the situations. It doesn't cover situations where the law of the land creates a situation in which the whole atmosphere is contrary to the will of God. That something is required which the Bible doesn't explicitly forbid, but it sure looks like it ought to be forbidden explicitly because it's so contrary to love. So here's my effort. I'm going to close with an effort to give you some criteria, because I think the days are coming when more will be in front of us. We got some decisions to make as a church. We're going to just fit in, be conformed to this world. Or we're going to stand up one of these days and say, no, we're not going there. You make a law that I have to hire on this staff a homosexual at church. I'll break the law. I'll go to jail. We have to decide where we're going to draw some lines here. Here are my criteria. Number one, the grievousness of the action sanctioned by law. How atrocious is it? Is it a traffic pattern you don't like in your city? I don't like it. I'm going down the one-way street. The wrong way. Or is it the killing of millions of children? There's a difference between not liking a traffic pattern and having babies slaughtered in the womb. Is it putting a whole group of people in bondage or at risk? Number two, the extent of the unjust law's effect. Is it a person affected here and there? Or is it millions? Extent. So grievousness first, extent second, third. The potential of civil disobedience for clear and effective witness to the truth. Now this one's really tough. The potential for civil disobedience for clear and effective witness to the truth. In other words, is this going to work? Does it have any prayer of having an effect? One of the reasons, a little confession here, one of the reasons that rescue operations are not happening today for the cause of the unborn and only lasted about 3 years in this country is because there were so many wackos. And I began to see that I couldn't manage these rescues. I was called upon often to stand in front of a group of 200 or 300 people, 6 o'clock in the morning, to get them on the buses to go sit. And I was to give them spiritual challenges for how to behave. And I knew there's only one thing that will carry the conscience of America. Suffering. Not feisty one-upmanship with the aborts across the street. They're shouting at you, shout back a more clever saying. Guess what? What goes on the media that night is your stupid statement. And your hard, angry face. What carried the day in the civil rights movement was the ugliness of the Bull O'Connors and the meekness of the suffering. We didn't have it. We didn't have it in the cause of life. We were just too mean. We did not have a broken heart. We just looked like the world doing our rebellious thing. And the world is not impressed with mirrors of itself. So the third one is the potential of a clear and effective witness. God made it the time in the 60s. I believe it was of God, and God made it not the time in the late 80s for the cause of life, but I don't know when it might come. Lastly, number 4, there has to be a movement of a spirit of courage and conviction in God's people so that a flashpoint arrives. A flashpoint. When there's such a spirit in the culture, in the movement. So it's called the movement. Where you just touch this with the flame of a Martin Luther King speech and phew! That might not have happened 20 years earlier, might not have happened 20 years later. There was an unusual moment in our history. It was in the music, it was in the air, it was in the soul, it was the moment. And God delivered us from very much sin. We have to discern when those times in history arrive. So let me close our whole time together with just a closing exhortation concerning if the day comes when you find yourself saying no, what spirit should you have? No to some evil. Vindictiveness should be gone. Concern for your mere personal safety should be gone. Expediency that things will go well for my house, when it might be torched or graffitied, I'm willing to pay without vindictiveness. The Lord cuts away our love for possessions, our love for convenience, our private benefit, clothes, possessions, safety. Instead, we become free from these things. We love others. Both the dying children and the killing abortionists. Mercy, mercy. We don't just say hate for the killers. We want him saved. It's amazing to me that as you listen to the testimonies of former abortion clinic administrators who have seen the light and changed, most of them changed through being personally loved by a pro-life person, not because their clinic went out of business through enough protests. Somebody got in their lives and stuck by them and kept sharing the gospel to them and said, God can even forgive 30,000 murders. Really? Really? There's hope beyond this horrible carnage? A tone and a demeanor in the Christian world of not strident, not belligerent, not rock throwing, not screaming, not swearing, not violent. We are people of the cross. The Lord submitted himself to crucifixion willingly to save his enemies, and we are called to take up our cross and do the same. Every time we bring justice to bear on anybody, whether we're firing an employee or sitting in protest, we are taking the log out of our own eye. And when you pull a log out of your eye, it hurts enough that there are tears. And the tears is what the world needs to see when we say our no to the injustices around us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Light and Truth, where we are committed to providing God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. On our next episode, John Piper begins a 2-part series titled Delighting God in Prayer. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.